Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us for this second panel on the complex reality of security and trade on the U.S. Mexico border. And again, my appreciation for my colleagues at the American Society Council of the Americas for the collaboration in this fantastic event. I want to welcome our guests and very briefly introduce them. I won't dwell on their bios, again, because we're compressed time schedule, but just to mention that we really have a very distinguished group of experts here to talk about the issues. We're joined by Michael Comunez, who's the president and CEO of Manat Jones Global Strategies, also somebody who formerly worked in the administration and Department of Commerce as Assistant Secretary at the International Trade Administration, somebody who's very familiar with U.S. Mexico relations. Angela Kucherga, who's a professor of practice at Arizona State University and also a journalist who's focused on the border for many, many years, also with Arizona PBS. And an old dear friend of mine, Chapel Lawson, professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and somebody who's very much guided some of my own thinking on borders, including, in the only time I'll plug this today, a book I edited on borders in the Americas that's available outside the door. So obligatory plug over. Let's go turn now to the conversation. So I'd like to start off with you, Michael, and we just heard a very sort of reasonable conversation about what's going on at the border. It's very rational, evidence-based, very nuanced, quite a contrast to, I think, some of the very negative rhetoric we keep hearing about U.S.-Mexico border and U.S.-Mexico relations in recent years. But even, I think, going back further, if we think about issues like NAFTA, where basically after 20 years, where we've seen an incredible growth in trade, in legal travel, in regional integration in North America, really kind of a deafening silence in both capitals on sort of the benefits of North American integration. So why don't you just lead us off and talk a little bit about where you see U.S.-Mexico relations today, and also sort of why the negativity or the negative tone you see out in the public debate.
Sure. Well, thank you, and it's great to be here this morning with all of you and with my distinguished panelists. It's great to appreciate the Council of the Americas and the Brookings Institution bringing us together and frankly giving a platform for, I think, a very important topic, particularly at this time in American history with the what I can only call the insanity that's circling in the political dialogue and the political discourse at the presidential level, sadly on both sides. I thought it was interesting, actually, and as a way of getting to answering your question, even the last panel with two congressmen who represent the border and who cared obviously deeply about the border, I thought it was interesting that I would just roughly estimate 75% of that panel, if not more, was focused on the subject of border security. And I think that pretty much says it all as to why we're in the situation we're in, both with the overall relationship with Mexico and the perceptions of Mexico that persist. There's no question that there is a security challenge related to drugs and narco trafficking that has already been fully discussed, and I'm not going to spend any more time on. But what amazes me, and I think what's at the heart of the current political dialogue that has NAFTA once again under attack, even by those who once supported it, the Republican establishment was the free trade voice in the United States, seems to have, at least the leading candidates in the party, have all but renounced and repudiated free trade. On the Democratic side, of course, you'd expect an anti-trade perspective from Bernie Sanders. I frankly have been a little disappointed to hear Secretary Clinton repudiate and distance herself both from the TPP, which she was obviously a big supporter of, and from NAFTA. So what's going on here and why all of this? I think first and foremost, the big issue is that Americans as a whole don't understand, and the political class fails to articulate, and I would also say the private sector has failed to articulate the benefits of the U.S.-Mexico relationship. I think it is basically largely, there's a profound lack of understanding and profound ignorance about what Mexico is today and what it means to the United States. The reality is we talk about Mexico as though it were a failed state, as though we had Afghanistan or something like it across the border. It's something that we have to build walls and protect ourselves against. In reality, the phenomenal reality is that Mexico is one of the most dynamic growth markets in the world. I will tell you, when I was at the Department of Commerce as Assistant Secretary promoting trade and investment all over the world, I visited, I think, virtually all of our leading trading partners in developed markets, in emerging economies, in developing economies. And of all of the countries I visited, I came away with a sense that there were two important growth markets for the United States. I turned out to be, I think, right about one and wrong about the other. Wrong because political events have intervened. But I thought Turkey and Mexico actually represented very strategic markets for the United States. And I'll leave Turkey aside for today. But Mexico, let's remember what we're talking about and who we're talking about. A G14 economy that is well on track to becoming a G10, if not a G7 nation within our lifetime. A nation of 120 million people that has fully embraced free trade and market principles, that has set itself on a path of structural reform since around the time of NAFTA through today and continuing. The reforms that were just passed through the Pacto por Mexico with energy reform and continued competition reform and telecommunications reform. The Mexican economy, although we don't see the stunning growth statistics that you see in China and India and in the day, Brazil, has consistently put up solid, robust growth, and growth that is based on a diversified, competitive economy, not an economy that's dependent on commodities. It's a manufacturing powerhouse that, most importantly, is geographically privileged. It is right across the Rio Grande, and it shares an integrated economy with the United States. I think what we fail to understand as a country, and it allows the kind of rhetoric to persist, is that we benefit tremendously from the relationship with Mexico. Everyone in this room, I think, probably is very familiar with the statistics. I'm not going to go into them, citing the volume and scale of trade. There's a well-known statistic that's tossed out there, which I'll close this portion of my remarks on, which is that 40% of imports from Mexico, and of course we have a trade deficit with Mexico, 40% of the imports from Mexico have U.S. content, right? That's from official U.S. government statistics. When I first heard that, when I was in office, I was trying to understand the significance of it and how to make it relevant to the average American voter. Because after all, in the post-NAFTA era, when we think of Mexico and we think of the economy, the dominant narrative is the great sucking sound. We've lost jobs. Mexico's taken our jobs. That's the argument that's going out in the campaign right now in Ohio and Michigan and other places. But that 40% statistic is telling, and we've not done a very good job of explaining what it really means. Because what it means is that because of the integrated nature of the North American manufacturing platform, the integrated nature of our supply chains between the United States and Mexico, when we trade with Mexico, we're actually manufacturing and making things together. And when Mexico manufactures and exports its products to us, its finished products to us, and we're the by far largest destination of Mexican manufacturing, it is pulling on American supply chains. It is creating and supporting American jobs. And so what's not understood is you build that wall, you shut down trade, you start a trade war with Mexico, as some of the folks are suggesting, and you will put millions of Americans out of work for a whole host of reasons. The tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers in the heartland of America, whose jobs depend on feeding the supply chain that leads to final finished manufactured goods in Mexico, those folks depend on trade with Mexico. So I think one of the great failings as a matter of public policy and as a matter of advocacy that has allowed the anti-Mexico rhetoric to go viral is that Americans just don't understand how interdependent we are with Mexico, how jobs in the heartland depend on trade with Mexico. Someone asked the congressman previously if they had one wish that they could get into the American culture. My wish would be that more Americans understood that the border, that the relationship with Mexico is not about the border at all. That we need a broader constituency for Mexico in the heartland of America that understands that everyday employees and that the American economy at large is dependent on trade with Mexico. And I think that's just been completely missing from the dialogue.
Thanks. No, excellent points all. And one of the things I'd like us to talk a little bit more about today is how this actually looks. How does this conversation look from the communities on the border, along both sides of the border. And Angela, one of the things I wanted you to maybe try to jump in here and talk about is what are people in Texas, in Arizona, in California at the border saying about these kinds of issues that Michael is raising, or the issues that were raised in the previous panel by the congressman?
Sure. Thank you, Harold, and thank you to the American Society, Council of the Americas and Brookings Institute for having this discussion. When I checked in last night in the hotel, the first thing I was asked, why am I in town? I said, we're here to have a talk about the border. And he said, oh, so it's about the wall, how high will it be, and who's going to pay for it? So unfortunately, that really has become the only discussion about the border on a national level. And I'm here to tell you, as you've heard from some of the people from the border, that the border's not a campaign soundbite. It really is the place we call home, where millions of people work, go to school, raise families. It's not this dangerous no man's land invaded by hordes of immigrants or criminals coming across. We do understand, living on the border, that, contraband is a fact of life, any border, and illegal goods going back and forth. But I want to make sure people understand that, as you also heard, that it's a safe place. And we have our share of problems, but I really think some of the solutions are coming from actual border residents. The other thing I think a lot of Americans don't realize, the view from the border is we do have a border fence. We have various versions of it up and down the border, which have been adapted to the environment, to the aesthetics, to the security needs along the border. And having covered the border for many years as a journalist and lived along the border and been up and down the border and into Mexico, the fence, even a top Border Patrol chief told me, is really not going to stop anyone. It will slow people down. It may divert people. It's another tool, but it's definitely not the end-all and only solution to security concerns. I would also agree and kind of echo the comments that security unfortunately dominates our discussion. And when you talk about security, it isn't one size fits all. And unfortunately, the response doesn't always meet the need along the border. I'll give you a couple quick anecdotes. I was recently in El Paso, Juarez, covering the Pope's visit. It was supposed to be a big celebration, a mass in Juarez, a city that has seen horrible violence. I've covered it day in and day out, and is now recovering, thank God. And, while you had jubilant celebrations in Mexico, a lot of Americans, a lot of U.S. citizens who we thought would come from across the border area didn't show up. And even those on the El Paso side were afraid to go. Officials had warned them, don't cross the border unless you have an urgent need. Well, part of the problem, maybe they were afraid of the long lines on the bridge, which we all can sympathize with. But the issue, I walked across the border to go cover the mass, and it was the bridge downtown was absolutely empty. I'd never seen anything like that. Ran into one family, 3 generations, including grandma in her wheelchair going across to the mass, and a lot of agents, who had been brought in from across the country to secure the border during the Pope's visit, including 2 from Washington, D.C., who were posted right on top of the bridge with high-powered weapons slung across their shoulders. So, real question, was that response necessary? And there is a cost involved economically. And then also the cost to communities that have to live kind of under that situation. So fear does drive a lot of policy. Another anecdote, and this is where I will be critical of my own profession, journalism. We aren't necessarily going beyond the rhetoric and the soundbite, especially if you're not on the border covering it. There had been a persistent rumor about ISIS training camps on the other side of the border in Anapra, right on the outskirts of Juarez. And, we kept saying, well, we're not going to cover it. We know it's a rumor. A website put it out there, and it was spread by social media. We eventually were forced to go out and dispel the rumor, to actually do what many people don't do, and actually show up and cover it. And the local people were, at first, they were saying it's rather humorous. We have not seen anybody training here. Others were upset that their neighborhood was being badmouthed. One man who was from Zacatecas said, people here know I'm not even from the area because I have a regional accent. So I think if we had people from another country, and large numbers of them training in Mexico, we would definitely know. And finally, this other man told me, my relatives from the U.S. keep calling and saying, oh, are there ISIS militants in Anapra training right there? I said, no, there are not, and we're here. We tell you, we've got your back. And I think that's the message that people need to understand. The strong family ties on both sides of the border, that really, we do have each other's backs, and the people there are really one community. And so when you look at security, we have to consider that fact too. And I'll just end in saying, of course people are afraid of things that they're unfamiliar with. I mean, I was afraid last night when I was watching the news about the metro shutdown. I thought, oh my God, how am I going to get here? And I even had, one station called it Metrogeddon. So, I think the more we know about something, the more we get real information, the less fear we'll have.
Thank you, Angela. I think that's a really good point. And Chapel, I know you thought a lot about security issues, and we probably have focused a lot on security in this event so far. But maybe you can help us think through, if maybe is the wall the right answer? If the wall is not the right answer, then how do we deal with what are the risks out there that we should be focusing on? Since we hear a lot about the kind of myths about the border, the riskiness of the border in our debate so far. So what should we be thinking about when it comes to that?
Yeah, you can see that Harold saves the uncontroversial and easy questions for his good friends. No, thank you very much.
I'm hoping he'll still talk to me after this.
Very kind of you to host. And actually, while I bide for time here in formulating a response to Harold's question, let me just thank everybody in the audience who are trading a beautiful spring day to be here with us. We're very grateful. And all my co-panelists from whom I'm learning a tremendous amount. Whether or not you want to build a wall depends on how much money you want to waste. I guess is the most straightforward answer I could give. Stepping back, there's not necessarily anything conceptually wrong with the idea of physical barriers between the ports of entry. A border can be divided into authorized ports of entry where everything is supposed to cross, people, goods, whatever. And then the stretches between the ports of entry where by definition any crossing or shipment is illegal, unless it's a wild animal wandering across the frontier. And but the conversation, I think, in Washington, outside the border region, tends to have a surreal quality for those people who are familiar with the area itself. For one, there are physical barriers all along the border. In some cases, triple fencing. In other cases, vehicle fencing. But basically, the entire non-lacustrine riverine border between the United States and Mexico has some kind of physical infrastructure there deterring illegal crossing. So we've long since reached the point of diminishing marginal returns on investment, as Beto was suggesting earlier, that if average apprehensions by a Border Patrol agent who operate between the ports of entry is, say, 17 people per year, adding more physical infrastructure, adding more Border Patrol agents between the ports of entry doesn't make any sense. But by contrast, we have an enormous infrastructure and staffing deficit at the ports of entry on which we depend for legal transit and commerce. And if we're in the realm of 100 to 200 million legal crossings per year at the ports of entry, and a tiny, tiny fraction of that being illegal crossings between the ports of entry, why would we not change the pattern of investment and turn, in the parlance of Customs and Border Protection, green shirts, Border Patrol agents into blue shirts in some fashion, those are customs officers at the ports of entry, because that's the way to both facilitate trade and enhance security at the border. Right now, we could waste a lot of money constructing additional physical barriers, but we have a huge, as one of our presidential candidates would say, infrastructure deficit at the border, and that is hobbling our ability to take advantage of mutually beneficial trade and transit between the United States and Mexico. So my first instinct would be to say, let's not waste any more money on physical barriers. And then, of course, I think as was suggested already by my co-panelists and by the congressman earlier, there are enormous costs, a non-economic sphere and non-security, to erecting further physical barriers. They divide communities unnecessarily sometimes. They have ecological implications. There's simply no rational discourse that would encourage you to invest your money in that direction. On this panel, I think we're really in danger of allowing facts and common sense to triumph over political rhetoric. And in the current political environment, that's sometimes difficult for people to swallow, but that is the reality of the border. And the best investments in both trade and security are to be made at the ports of entry.
Thank you, Chapel. I mean, I think there is a risk of us being relentlessly reasonable in this event today, and that might be a little bit out of sync with the kind of conversations that we've been having in the country. But in the spirit of being reasonable and of being practical and thinking about how we can actually make things better, maybe I could just ask the same question of all of you before we go to the audience to try to take some of your questions, which is sort of what is the sort of the short-term and the long-term thing? Like, what would you like to see done within the next year, and what would you like to see done by the end of the next administration to actually improve things at the border in ways that benefit the United States and both countries actually? But let's just go in the same order. Michael, why don't you lead off?
Well, it's interesting. I was just in Las Vegas on Friday, along with Chris Wilson from the Mexico Institute and a few others. We are in the process of trying to bring together stakeholders from around the border, from Brownsville all the way to San Diego, to create a coalition to provide an alternative voice about the border and the needs of the border. And just to reflect on some of the takeaways from that group of stakeholders, people from the border. I was also born and raised in Las Cruces, New Mexico, just 30 miles from the border, so I have a strong appreciation for the region itself and the ecosystem down there. But what I'd like to see in the short term, and I think this is consistent with the views of the border economic development organizations and stakeholders that I was just with on Friday, is the following in the short term and the long term. Number one, I think, as I said earlier, I think we need to stop thinking of the border as a place where we have bridges that allow trucks and commerce to sort of flow through. And we tend to think of the border synonymously with infrastructure, border crossings, and with security and all those related dimensions. I think what we have to understand is that we've got an incredibly dynamic ecosystem along the U.S. Mexico border where innovation is happening. I mean, I don't know if how many of you know that one of the hottest new industries in the world is drone technology, right? Unmanned aerial vehicles. And the hotbed of drone technology is Tijuana, Mexico, and San Diego, California. And the guys that created 3D robotics, for example, a Mexican and an American, a Mexican engineer, by the way, and an American investor and CEO, have this truly binational enterprise that's reinventing an innovative, and it's really creating an innovative industry in the U.S. Mexico border region. You've got advanced manufacturing on both sides of the border. You've got these dynamic, connected regions, this ecosystem that's a living organism up and down the border. And we, as a matter of federal policy, as a matter of federal public policy and leadership, don't really give the border its due. We tend to think of it as, in the words of some of the recent reports that have come out, these pass-through economies where things flow through, and we got to secure those border crossings, whether it's people or commerce or goods, but we don't really invest enough in the region itself. So what I'd like to see is, number one, I'd like to see the high-level economic dialogue, which is this new bilateral strategic platform, which is now really the center of gravity in the bilateral relationship, managing issues of strategic competitiveness, North American competitiveness. I'd like to see that institution become much more focused and centered around creating competitiveness in the border region itself. I'd like to see the interagency of the United States government, for example, focused on bringing together all of the resources from the Economic Development Agency, the Small Business Administration, the private sector, and others, thinking about how we do really meaningful thinking about creating innovation and economic development in the border. I'd like to see the NAD Bank recapitalized and have its mandate expanded so it's able to invest in a wide range of public projects with increasing private participation through PPPs. There's a whole lot we can do. If we took and made the border a serious public policy priority, we would see immediate economic benefits to the country. We'd see in the short term and the long term. So, the discussion in Las Vegas last week, I think, was very consistent with these ideas. People really want the capitals in both countries to understand that these communities are vibrant, dynamic places of innovation, big contributors to economic growth, and not just places where semi-trucks pass through hauling products from one maquila or one manufacturing place to another. So in the short term, I'd like to see us get serious about how we think about the border and completely overhaul and reinvent the way we approach public policy related to the border, getting off of these obsessive themes of security and containment, and starting to really think about how we look at the border as a place to invest and grow and contribute to the dynamism that is North America.
Angela?
So I think you're hearing this repeated, but I will repeat it again. I think any policy really has to take border voices into account and learn from those voices. And these are the stakeholders who can help you come up with solutions to problems and increase the benefits we see at the border. I think you're seeing some of that already. A lot of these ideas, you heard Congressman Beto O'Rourke talking about how El Paso's paying for extra CPB officers. Also had the chance to tour the CBX terminal. Some of you may know and have used it actually in Tijuana, where you come from San Diego, walk right into the airport, take a flight into Mexico, direct flights all over Mexico, even some to China. That's innovative. Hopefully we'll see that up and down the border. That's a private enterprise, a border idea. And also in the realm of what I would call social infrastructure, all those problems we talked about in Juarez, there are wonderful nonprofits who have done incredible work. One I will tell you about, I met Lupita Davila. She's a mother of one of the teenagers killed in that horrible birthday party massacre where student athletes were gunned down. She lost her son, and she and her husband and the football coaches got together and started an organization to prevent violence, increase conflict resolution for both parents and students, and now helping provide psychological counseling for some of the children who experience that violence. So very proactive, and they are starting to get funding from the federal government in Mexico. Many other examples like that. Ian Brownlee was in Juarez as Consul General. He knows very well some of the hard work and some of the partnering that went on also with the U.S. organizations. So we need more of that, more ideas and solutions coming from border residents, because we know the issues, we know the problems, and the solutions are out there.
Yeah, we've talked a lot, and I know there are people in the audience who really want to ask questions, so I'm gonna be brief in response to your magic wand question. If I had a varilla mágica and I could wave it once, I would say I'd like to see the discourse change, and I'd like to see it change in three ways. First of all, I would like us to stop talking about the border as if it's this alien, lawless land, and instead talk about it as it really is. Secondly, I think I'd like to recognize more shared responsibility for all the problems that do exist sort of near border communities or at the border itself. We talked about the flow of drugs into the United States from Mexico. We talked much less about the flow of guns and bulk cash into Mexico from the United States, but from the perspective of our adversaries, criminal organizations, this is a single network. And we have to shift our own thinking from caring only about what's coming into the United States to caring also about what's going out. And I think Mexico would embrace that same notion of collaborative management of the border. And finally, again, just to be brief here, I think we have fallen into a trap on our rhetoric about border safety. Somehow we have allowed ourselves to be persuaded that we have to secure the border before we have any meaningful conversations about the real causes of the problems at the border related to immigration or to, say, criminal organizations. And I would flip that discourse entirely. I would say the border is incredibly secure, especially relative to what it's ever been at any other point in our history. But it will never be fully secure until we address the demand side problems in the United States that are the root cause of undocumented immigration and drug consumption in criminal enterprises. So that message is the one I would like to get out. Maybe the shortest answer is more events like this, not just in Washington, not just in the border region, but in those places where such messages are received with greater skepticism.
Well put. So we have time. I'm going to take a round of 3 questions, same rules as before. Please identify yourself and any institutional affiliation, and wait for the microphone before asking your question. I'll take one in the front row, but if you put your hands up, I'll try to keep track of 2 or 3 people.
Hi, my name is Andrea Tanco from the Mexico Institute. So a lot of the political rhetoric in these elections has been focusing on building a wall, but truth is that there is already a wall, not as large, not covering the whole border, but there is. So if you could elaborate on the negative impact of the wall at the border, and if our economies are becoming more and more integrated, and if we achieve that level of collaboration between governments in border security, could we see the conversation shifting to actually removing this border?
Thank you. I think there was one in back, and then we'll come to Viridiana here in front, and we'll see if we have time for the second round.
Ira Tynowitz from MLEX News Service. I just want to understand some of the campaign rhetoric and what its impact on the wall. We have one of the candidates who's talking about imposing some sort of tariffs on Oreo, the makers of Oreos, the makers of Ford, and the makers of Carrier when they bring stuff back into the United States. If that were to happen, how much of an impact would it have on trade with the United States, and is it possible to keep NAFTA under those circumstances, and would it have a significant impact on trade with Mexico?
And I think one more here in front, Viridiana.
Thank you. Viridiana Rios, a fellow at the Wilson Center. One thing we haven't discussed is what Mexico is thinking and what Mexico is doing. Right now, Mexico is having very serious discussions about legalizing marijuana. And also it's having very serious discussions about how they are going to react after the shift in the narrative of the campaign, particularly the wall. So is there something that the experts could say about these two issues and how that may affect the U.S. in the short term?
Well, thanks. And I'll change things up this time. I'll start with Chappell, put him on the spot again, and then work our way back.
All right, I'll change things up too, and I'll start with the question from Viri, my fellow at the Wilson Center. I think it's great to bring in the Mexican perspective. One of the things that I think is most auspicious about the bilateral relationship is that if you'd switched Beto and William with someone else from the Mexican side of the border, they would have said probably almost the exact same thing that our congressman said. And I think if you switched us with experts on the other side of the border who actually care about the region and these issues, they would say more or less the exact same things. So there's been tremendous convergence in identifying opportunities for mutual benefit. I won't speak to the marijuana issue. You heard one of the congressmen advocate for legalization of marijuana. However you come out on that issue, the key is to think about the demand side of drugs rather than the supply side, and especially rather than trying to stop something coming in at a particular line in the sand, which is a nonsensical approach to counter-narcotics policy. With regard to, yes, the Wilson Center, Wilson is a wonderful place for the study of Mexico. I would say first things first. There may be a world like that in the future, that it looks more like the northern border of the United States with Canada than it does like the current southern border. But right now we have a lot of work to do in solidifying the relationships that do exist between U.S. and Mexican law enforcement or U.S. and Mexican economic partners. And that's where I would focus my energy. And that's, I guess, related ultimately to the question about NAFTA. No, of course, reimposing tariffs would shred NAFTA, which has been enormously economically beneficial for all three partners. And you can't have it both ways. You can't reintroduce protectionism and not expect that your trading partners will also do the same, to the great economic detriment of the United States and to the destruction of, as one of my co-panelists put it, millions of jobs in the United States to depend on this cross-border trade.
So we often hear that question about legalizing marijuana. I actually have a fellow journalist, Mexican journalist, who just wrote a book about that. She's in Mexico City right now, about to launch it. And so it is a talk on both sides of the border. And you heard the congressman talk about it. I think it's going to happen. It's happening state by state in the U.S. And that what we've seen in response is a huge spike in heroin and meth smuggling across the border. So again, it's about the culture of contraband. What's the next best illegal thing we can bring across the border and get a good price from Mexico? And what's the demand in the U.S.? So I don't think we're going to end organized crime by legalizing marijuana or this or that drug. There's always going to be something else going in both directions. It's just the nature of borders. As far as the border fence, wall, whatever you want to call it, it isn't going to go away. It has very limited results, and I think, again, it's getting to the root cause of the issue. I've interviewed so many people who, refugees and immigrants fleeing, coming for jobs that are waiting for them, risking their lives for busboy jobs, and others fleeing violence in Mexico and Central America. they're fleeing death, and a wall or fence is not, and we're seeing that in Europe as well, not going to stop people who are trying to seek a new life. So we need to look at the root causes of why people are leaving and what they're coming for, the demand, what they are getting when they come as a real solution, not necessarily a fence.
Michael.
So let me try to take them in reverse order as well. On the issue of the Mexican perspective, and we have the former ambassador who's just arrived, so he'll be able to speak more to that. But I would just say this as a close friend of Mexico, someone who spends a lot of time in Mexico. We have an office there in Mexico City and in Monterrey. I'm there, once or twice a month. I think the Mexicans are rightfully deeply offended by the rhetoric that is going around, as they should be. I think there's a certain level of outrage that you saw manifest in former President Fox, who said, drop the F-bomb in reference to, we're not building that wall. And however inelegant that might be, it reflects, I think, the anger beneath the surface. One of the things I want to comment on that I think we would do very well to take to heart as Americans is in understanding and appreciating just how deeply offensive this rhetoric is and how it's got to end. Because it's no longer the case that we can say, oh, well, it's this fringe candidate who's never going to be elected. Increasingly, it's looking like it's becoming, especially as more candidates start talking about repudiating NAFTA and whatnot, it's becoming more, there's this contagion effect. Number one, we have benefited. I mean, Congressman O'Rourke earlier mentioned that we shouldn't forget that the Mexicans have a short memory and that it's taken a lot of years to overcome the fact that we went to war with Mexico and seized half their country, and that's just a fact. It's an inconvenient historical truth that we have to recognize, and what was, I think, a very pretextual war. That memory exists. Number two, we have a long history of anti-immigrant, anti-Mexico initiatives, Prop 187 in California, and a bunch of other things. So it seems like this anti-Mexico thing keeps building. We have enjoyed peaceful border relations, and if you look at the world and the state of the world where conflict reigns, we should really take to heart how blessed we are as a nation to have a nation like Mexico as our neighbor, a peaceful neighbor that basically actually shares many of our values. I worry, frankly, that this rhetoric is going to give rise domestically in Mexico, which, by the way, is an emerging, thriving democracy. They just elected their first independent candidate as governor in Nuevo León, which was a big shock to the political system. It's a multi-party system. How would America feel if, in response to this rhetoric, a radicalized candidate surfaced in Mexico with hostile anti-American rhetoric? I mean, Donald Trump, let's not forget, has actually alluded to the possibility of war to enforce his threats, which is preposterous. We're not going to war. But I mean, the fact that it's even out there is insane. That's why I started earlier and said it's insane. So I think the next president of the United States is going to have a lot of work to do to repair and restore faith and trust and confidence. And notwithstanding the very good work we've done in this administration, I believe, creating the high-level economic dialogue, shifting the focus away from security to competitiveness and economic cooperation, a lot of that has been undone. So that's the Mexico perspective that I worry about deeply. The idea of whether the wall could ever go away, I think we're a long way from that. But I do think, as I said earlier, as this country comes to respect and embrace and own the fact that we are in a mutually interdependent relationship with Mexico, where we benefit significantly from that relationship, I'd like to think there's a time in the future when that could happen. But I think we're a long way from it. That said, I think Mexico has a lot to do on its part. I mean, I think let's be honest. The Mexican government needs to continue its reform agenda. It needs to become a more transparent country. It needs to deal with the rampant. I used to think the problem was corruption. I now think the real issue is impunity, and it has the laws on the books. It needs to enforce them, and we need to see better evidence of that. But I think as those two things happen simultaneously, the countries will continue to come together. And finally, with respect to the question in the back about NAFTA. What would Trump's unilateral tariffs mean? First of all, NAFTA is a treaty. It's been ratified. So Trump, even if he were elected, is bound by the laws of the United States. The treaty is the supreme law of the land. So he can choose, I suppose, as president to abrogate that treaty. But whether he has the legal authority to do so, I think, is a different matter. I don't believe he will. Let's not forget this is a guy who hypocritically is also manufacturing in Mexico and taking advantage of NAFTA just as he's criticizing it. So, I think that notwithstanding the terrible rhetoric that's going on, I don't believe there will be unilateral tariffs. I don't believe there will be a trade war. I don't believe there's any political constituency in the United States, in Congress or otherwise, to support it, notwithstanding the campaign rhetoric. And I think what we have to do as a community of people who care about this relationship and who understand its importance to our country is to continue to be vocal, to continue to vociferously speak out against what we're seeing, to continuously advocate and educate people everywhere, including in the heartland of America, about the importance of this relationship.
Great, thank you. I think we maybe have time for a couple more quick questions. Let's see, go to Ambassador Maisto, and then here in the front row, and then back to this person over there. Are you, okay. John?
Yes, John Maisto, retired U.S. diplomat. I was intrigued by the comments about the innovation in the border area, the drone technology. Could you give some more examples of binational in the border area or complementary projects? I think showing some examples would be a good response to the people who are talking about building walls and establishing tariffs. There is so much interaction in the border area with a population. What number are we giving these days? 30 million, 40 million in the border area between the United States and Mexico, going back 100 miles or so. That's a powerhouse in its own right. If we could call more attention to the real world economic partnerships going on, I think that would help us who are trying to get the word out.
Great. Over here in the front.
Hi, thank you. My name is Edwin Lopez. I'm with McLarty Associates. I'm actually wondering, so I was born and raised at the border, and a lot of the businesses, and we're talking about economic growth, the most successful businesses have been cross-border, that have storefronts both in the U.S. and Mexican side or import-export consistently. This week on Monday, Mexico, or Peña Nieto, enacted a 24-hour business creation reform in Mexico. So I'm wondering, talking about the U.S. side, what are some of the steps that we can take, or some of the initiatives that we can look at that are looking to decrease some of the bureaucratic red tape that impedes business growth on both sides of the border?
Thank you. And I think one more here in the middle.
Hello, Alejandro Garcia, U.S. State Department. My question is about foreign assistance. We've invested quite a bit. The Merida Initiative continued to invest quite a bit. What could we be doing? How would you target that funding to strengthen law enforcement capacity, modernize the border on the Mexican side? There's a lot of interest about the Mexico southern border. I'm just curious your take on foreign assistance.
Great.
I'm going to start. Sure. I'm happy. I mean, on the issue of economic complementarity, cross-border trade, new industries, I don't even know where to start. I mean, obviously, automobiles have been a longstanding sector, but right around the border more recently in the last 20 years, solar cells, electricity generation, especially renewable energy, pipelines. I mean, the list could go on, but maybe this is a very good point, well taken, that we should be trotting out the examples more aggressively whenever we have the opportunity. I'm sure my co-panelists will chime in on this issue. Related to cross-border trade and integration of, say, electricity grids or pipeline grids, there are some issues on the border we haven't really talked about. One of them involves water management. We have multiple shared resources in water, some that flow south, some that flow north, some that flow west to east, aquifers that run underground between the two countries, some of which are in commerce with the Rio Grande. And we've done a tremendous job since 1944 in jointly managing those resources. But we could do an even better job because it's one of those opportunities for collaborative border relationships where what, say, one does on one side of the border can actually be mutually beneficial for both. So deforestation upstream in the Colorado River actually affects net downflow and the amount of water available to be then divvied up at the border. And so thinking about these water resources in terms of comprehensive watershed management, the way we might think about the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River, is a tremendous step forward. And we could do even more than the International Boundary and Water Commission has already done to strengthen that relationship, including not only volume of water, but water quality. And then I won't go into greater detail, but obviously, there are issues of offshore drilling and management of the Gulf of Mexico, in which there are further opportunities for collaboration. So when we widen the aperture of the border and don't just think about trade or security, there's many more opportunities for mutually beneficial collaboration. In terms of the Merida money, my answer is yes. Yes, all of it. A marginal dollar invested in Mexican law enforcement capacity does more for American security than a marginal dollar invested in the U.S. Border Patrol right now. And there are many things that could be done in Mexico to strengthen the rule of law, decrease impunity. A federal witness program would be wonderful, obviously more on the prosecutorial and penitentiary side in Mexico, and those would be tremendously valuable investments for the United States to help make. Southern border as well. But to me, the Mexican government has done a tremendous job of investing in the federal police, including vetted units, as well as in the sort of takedown marine units that are sequestered. What's a little bit lagging, I think, is the judicial, prosecutorial, penitentiary side of things, and that's what most needs to be reinforced right now. If we're offering prescriptions for the other country, in a sense, those seem to loom at the top of the list. Though, from our own perspective, obviously we have work to do as well. But if you're thinking about Merida money and marginal dollars best invested, that's where I would put it.
I would just add for the Merida and foreign aid, and we've already seen some of this happen. The focus in the beginning was just police, law enforcement training and equipment. It's now expanded to train prosecutors, but also some of those social infrastructure needs, building resilient communities, very critical, helping youth along the border, violence prevention, building up local businesses, helping families. That really does pay off, and not just immediately, but for generations to come.
So I think the Merida issue has been fully addressed. I would just say capacity building and being more flexible with the Merida resources is important for the reasons that have already been articulated. On the issue of other examples, I mean, again, they've been addressed. But what I would say is this is why I refer to the border region as an ecosystem, whether it's medical device technology, whether it's, you've mentioned automotives, solar energy. SunPower, one of the most prominent solar energy firms in the world, is making the most innovative solar panels in the world in Mexicali, right? And it goes on and on from there. I was down in the El Paso region. The VA has just opened a new hospital that's focused on traumatic brain injury, and the Borderplex Alliance down there is trying to figure out how do you create a cluster around treating medical care around traumatic brain injury using that hospital as an anchor. So again, Chris and the North American Research Partnership in Arizona, the Wilson Center just put out a report on cluster mapping, clusters in the border region. So again, this goes to my basic point, which is if we think about the border as bridges and ports of entry, as a place where we have to move goods and services, and as pass-through communities, we're missing half of the equation at least. The border itself is a place of dynamic economic growth and innovation, and there are plenty of stories. Those stories are just not being told. I remember, for example, just to wrap up, I was traveling with President Obama to Mexico when the first time he met President Peña Nieto. We went down to the Palacio Nacional, and after the bilateral meeting in Mexico City, he asked me to go to Querétaro to visit. We were going to take the message and amplify it out. And I had a chance to not only meet the governor and some of the leaders in Querétaro, but I visited GE's research center in Querétaro. GE, the iconic American manufacturer. And what I learned was that GE engineers, jet aircraft engineers, Mexican engineers, were designing and innovating on GE's aircraft designs. And those design elements were being sent back to the United States and manufactured in places like Ohio and South Carolina and in manufacturing states in the United States. So it sort of flipped the whole idea of NAFTA on its head, right? That Mexican engineers were providing the intellectual capital that was then leading to blue-collar jobs in the United States. I mean, those stories just aren't told, you know. That has facilitated, you know, billions of dollars in revenue for GE as it expands its sales throughout the Americas. And there are other examples at 3M and other places. So I think that the fundamental point is we got to see the relationship more holistically. And finally, to the question about, you know, what can be done, you mentioned the president's reform, and Mexico continues to reform and improve the indicators on the doing business, you know, in standards and whatnot. What I think something that will put you all to sleep if I mention it, and it's boring and policy wonkish, but you know, regulatory cooperation is hugely important. You've got industries that are collaborating, that are cross-border in nature, and yet we've got still have different standards for, you know, that manufacturers have to meet. If we could further deepen the harmonization of standards and other regulations so that you could have one economic zone for manufacturing, for example, or for providing services, that would dramatically improve the competitiveness. And there are, you know, institutional relationships and the bilateral relationship to focus on that. But again, it's so wonky, people get bored by it. But it's hugely important. If you talk to captains of industry in this space, that's what they want, right after better borders.
No, thank you. And I think we still have a couple more minutes before Senator John Cornyn and Ambassador Sarikhan take the stage for the final concluding conversation of this event today. But I want to pick up on this point that you've mentioned on collaboration, because we talked about what the U.S. government could do, what the Mexican government could do. We talked about private sector collaboration, but I know there's some initiatives for more collaboration between the governments, and I think you just pointed to regulatory harmonization. If you could put that in the context of maybe the TPP discussions between the two governments, and to what extent do those kinds of conversations, are those conversations now being blown up to like an even bigger stage with more countries? And Chappell, you've actually also talked about collaborative security, joint inspection facilities. We heard from Congressman Hurd this morning, and you know, what are the opportunities for that kind of collaboration between the two governments to issue these policies? And so if we could just quickly touch on those issues, and Angela, if you want to jump in at the local level, or things that you've seen actually work in terms of, you know, border city collaboration, because I mean, there are governments across both sides of the border at the local and state levels that, of course, work together occasionally.
Well, what I would say is, despite the political rhetoric, this is actually in some ways, we're at a pinnacle of cooperation between the U.S. And Mexican governments. You know, since NAFTA, I used to say when I was in government that I felt that the relationship was kind of on autopilot. But starting a few years ago, we began to recognize the importance of really creating infrastructure, platforms that would force our governments at the highest levels to get together and talk about issues of competitiveness. It's insane that the United States, Canada, and Mexico don't get together and talk meaningfully about how we compete as a regional economic bloc, how we address the rise of China, how we compete with the European Union, how we compete with the emerging economies in the ASEAN or APEC region. And so we've finally begun to do that in a really meaningful way. And to your point, the high-level economic dialogue was established in 2013. And through the HLED, as we call it, there are, you know, there's very specific emphasis at the highest levels. I mean, Vice President Biden, Secretary Pritzker, the Secretary of Energy, and others were just down in Mexico City just a couple of weeks ago talking about these issues. And I think the TPP is the next extension of that relationship. It definitely multilateralizes it, if you will. But just in the bilateral context, there's a lot of deep cooperation that's trying to help break some of the log jams that exist that have held up some of these issues for some time.
So I think we're just about ready to start the next segment of the program, but if maybe I could just get 30 seconds from each of you if you want to jump in on some specific.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we are at a pinnacle in a sense, but we're not at the highest peak. And let me try to sketch out very briefly what I think the highest peak looks like. First of all, paradigmatically, it's a shift away from a 19th century notion of the border and of sovereignty as managing a line in the sand to a more collaborative approach that sees mutual benefit in managing a shared border. And we don't think about doing everything at the physical boundary itself, but rather wherever it's most efficient to do so. And that encompasses trade, law enforcement, and a bunch of other spheres. What does that look like, say, in the most wonkish and boring level at a port of entry? It looks like a single building with an open floor plan right along the border itself, straddling the boundary with a little dotted red line along the middle of the border, among the middle of the building, indicating the border itself. And if not cross-deputized officers, at least officers from both sides in the same building doing single entry processing and able to communicate with each other real time while looking at more or less the same information on their screens. That is, in a sense, I guess, the physical manifestation of collaborative border management in the 21st century.
And I'll be very, very brief. We need to continue this discussion, and we, the Cronkite School of Journalism, and two major media partners, we're going to be doing polling on both sides of the border, up and down the border, to find out what border residents want, give some perspective, some opinions, some solutions, and we'll be doing stories, and this will be released before both of the conventions this summer, so we'll have some real voices to add to this debate.
Fantastic. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists for a great conversation.